Every evening, as the sun started to dip down behind the tall, cold buildings of the city, he would appear. He was a man who seemed to be made of shadows and forgotten things. People who rushed past him on the sidewalk didn't see a person. They saw an obstacle, a reminder of a life they hoped to never have. His coat was a dark, heavy blanket, patched in so many places it was hard to tell what the original color might have been. His pants were worn thin at the knees, and his shoes, held together with bits of twine, left faint. Scuffing sounds on the pavement as he walked. He never looked anyone in the eye. His gaze was always fixed on the ground a few feet ahead of him, as if he was following a path only he could see. But his path always led to the same place. It was a quiet corner of a street that was usually loud with traffic and hurried footsteps. There, nestled between a bright, loud coffee shop and a closed-down bookstore, was a large, elegant window. The gold letters on the glass spelled out Alistair's fine pianos. To most people, it was just a shop, an expensive one they would never enter. But to him, it was a cathedral. It was the end of his day's long journey, the beginning of his only peace. He would stop a few feet from the glass, not too close to seem like a threat, but close enough to see inside. The window was his television, his movie screen, his connection to a world he had lost a long time ago. Inside, the light was always soft and warm, casting a gentle glow on the polished wooden floors. And in that glow, they sat. The pianos. They weren't just instruments to him. They were like beautiful, sleeping creatures. A big, black grand piano, shiny and perfect, sat in the center of the display, looking like a king on its throne. Next to it were smaller ones, some a deep, rich brown, others a sleek, modern white. They all had their lids propped open, revealing the clean, white and black keys that looked like perfect rows of teeth. He would stand there, sometimes for an hour, just watching. His breath would fog up a small circle on the cold glass, and he would wipe it away with the sleeve of his coat, only for it to appear again a moment later. He didn't move. He didn't beg. He didn't make a sound. He was just a statue, a silent guardian watching over the treasures inside. Inside the shop, a young woman with a neat ponytail named Chloe was often tidying up. She would see the man outside. At first, it made her nervous. She would walk near the door, making sure it was locked, and shoot a wary glance in his direction. But after weeks of seeing him do the same thing, she got used to him. He became part of the background, like the old street lamp on the corner or the flickering open sign. He was just the piano man, a quiet, sad fixture of the evening. She would dust the sheet music, straighten the benches, and go about her work, barely giving him a second thought. But the owner, Mr. Alistair, was different. He was an older man, with kind eyes and hands that were always stained with a little bit of wood polish. He noticed everything. He would watch the man from his small office in the back. He saw more than just a homeless man. He saw the way the man's shoulders, which were usually slumped in defeat, would straighten ever so slightly as he looked at the pianos. He saw the intense focus in his eyes, a look that wasn't of want, but of deep, painful longing. It was a look of recognition, of seeing a part of yourself that you thought was gone forever. Mr. Alistair noticed the man's hands most of all. They were rough and dirty, with nails that were broken and rimmed with grime. They looked like hands that had done hard labor, hands that had known cold and hunger. But sometimes, as the man stared at the keys, his fingers would twitch. They would move slightly, curling and uncurling at his sides, as if they were remembering something. They were the fingers of a player, Mr. Alistair thought. A player who hadn't played in a very, very long time. The man outside, whose name was Elias, was lost in his own world. As he looked at the grand piano, he could almost hear it. He could hear the deep, resonant boom of the low bass notes, sound that would vibrate up through the floor and into his bones. He could hear the bright, clear chime of the high notes, like tiny bells ringing in a quiet church. He remembered the feel of the cool, smooth ivory under his fingertips. He remembered the weight of the keys as they pressed down, the way they would spring back up, ready for the next note. It was a feeling so real, so powerful, that his own fingers would start to move, playing a silent song on the cold, hard air of the sidewalk. He didn't let himself think about the past too much. It was a place that brought too much pain. But the pianos? They pulled the memories out of him, whether he wanted them or not. He would see a flash of a sunny room, the smell of his mother's cooking, the sound of laughter. He would feel the pride in his father's voice. Then, just as quickly, the memories would turn dark. The images would blur, the sounds would fade. All that would be left was the cold, empty silence that had been his companion for years. The pianos were a reminder of everything he had loved and everything he had lost. And yet, he couldn't stay away. They were the only beautiful thing left in his world. As the city lights began to twinkle in the deepening twilight, Elias would feel a familiar chill. It was time to go. He would give the pianos one last, long look, a look that was both a goodbye and a promise. Then he would turn, pull his thin coat tighter around his body, and melt back into the shadows of the alleyways, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. Inside the warm shop, Mr. Alistair would watch him go, a thoughtful frown on his face. He knew there was a story behind those silent, begging eyes, and he had a feeling that one day he was going to hear it. The sky turned a dark, bruised gray long before the sun was ready to set. A cold, heavy rain began to fall, not in a gentle drizzle, but in a determined, pouring sheet that hammered against the pavement and turned the streets into shimmering black rivers. For the man who lived on the streets, this was more than just an inconvenience. It was a direct assault. The rain soaked through his thin coat within minutes, sending a deep, biting chill into his bones. It plastered his hair to his forehead and made his clothes feel like a second cold skin. People hurried past him under colorful umbrellas, their faces turned down, their steps quick, as if he and the rain were both parts of the same miserable landscape to be avoided. He reached his usual spot, the corner by the piano shop window, but the rain made it impossible to see clearly. The world inside was a blurry, warm watercolor painting. He could see the soft glow of the lights in the dark. Beautiful shape of the grand piano, but the details were lost, distorted by the rivulets of water racing down the glass. He wiped a patch of the window with his sleeve, but it was useless. The rain just covered it again. A wave of something stronger than his usual sadness washed over him. It was a mix of frustration and a deep, aching loneliness. Tonight of all nights, he needed to see it. He needed to see the keys, the promise of the music, the one beautiful thing that still felt real to him. The rain wasn't just wet. It was washing away his last bit of hope, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. He stood there for a long time, shivering, his teeth chattering quietly. He watched the blurry shapes of people moving inside the warm, dry shop. He saw the young woman, Chloe, laughing with a customer. He saw the owner, Mr. Alistair, walking slowly, his hand trailing along the polished wood of a smaller piano. They were in a different world, a world of warmth and music and comfort, and he was on the outside looking in literally and figuratively. The thought that had been brewing in the back of his mind for weeks, a wild, crazy thought, suddenly pushed its way to the front. What if just for a moment, he could be in that world? The rain seemed to give him a strange kind of courage, or maybe it was just desperation. He was so cold, so tired of being invisible. He had to try. Taking a deep, shaky breath, he pushed open the heavy glass door. A little bell chimed, a sound so clear and out of place in his world of distant sirens and shouting that it made him flinch. He stumbled inside, bringing the storm with him. Water dripped from his coat onto the pristine marble floor, forming small, dark puddles. The sudden warmth of the shop was a shock to his system. The air smelled of lemon oil and old wood, a smell that was so familiar it hurt. He stood there for a moment, dripping, a dark, chaotic stain on the perfect, orderly scene. "You can't be in here." The voice was sharp and belonged to Chloe. She was walking towards him, her face a mask of professional annoyance mixed with a hint of fear. She held a duster in her hand like a weapon. "You're making a mess. You need to leave." But he didn't seem to hear her. His eyes had found what they were looking for. There it was. The concert grand. It was even more beautiful up close. The black lacquer was so deep and shiny, he could see his own distorted, ragged reflection in it. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a living thing, a beast of beauty and power, silently waiting. He took a step towards it, his wet shoes making a loud squeaking sound on the clean floor. "Sir, I'm talking to you," Chloe said, her voice rising. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "This is a private business. You can't just come in off the street like this." He finally looked at her, but his eyes were unfocused, as if he was looking through her. He gently moved to the side, his movement slow and deliberate, and continued his walk towards the piano. He ignored her completely. His entire being was focused on the bench, the fallboard, the keys. It was as if an invisible string was pulling him forward, and he was powerless to resist. Chloe was about to say more, to raise her voice, maybe even call for security. But Mr. Allister emerged from his office. "Chloe, what's all the—" He stopped when he saw the man. He saw the puddles on the floor, the desperate look in the man's eyes, the direct path he was taking towards the most expensive piano in the shop. But Mr. Allister didn't see a threat. He saw the same man from the window, but now he was here in the flesh. And the longing in his eyes was no longer a quiet, distant thing. It was a raw, powerful, and overwhelming force. The man reached Mr. Allister and stopped. He was so close now that the older man could smell the rain and the damp wool of his coat. He looked smaller up close, his shoulders slumped, his frame thin under the wet clothes. He looked down at his own hands, which were clenched into fists at his sides. Then he looked up, and his eyes met Mr. Allister's. They were filled with a pain so deep it was almost physical.
"Please,"
he whispered. His voice was rough, like gravel, as if he hadn't used it properly in years. It cracked on the single word. He cleared his throat and tried again, a little louder this time. "Please." He unclenched his fists and held his hands out in front of him. They were dirty, the nails were broken, but they were trembling with a strange energy. "Just 1 minute. That's all I ask." Chloe was at Mr. Allister's side now. "Sir, we can't. It's a very valuable instrument. I really think you should leave." But the man's eyes were locked on Mr. Allister, pleading. "Let me touch it," he begged, his voice cracking again with emotion. "I won't break it. I swear I need to. Please." He said the word please like it was a prayer, the only word he had left. It wasn't a demand. It was a confession. It was the sound of a man's soul breaking. Mr. Allister looked from the man's desperate face to his trembling hands, and then over to the perfect, untouched piano. Every business instinct he had told him to say no. It was a risk. It was foolish. But then he looked back into the man's eyes, and he saw something else. He saw a flicker of the person this man used to be. He saw a lifetime of unplayed music, a river of notes dammed up behind years of pain and silence. He saw that this wasn't about touching a piano. This was about touching a lost part of himself. To say no would be like refusing a drink of water to a man dying of thirst. He took a slow breath and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards Chloe, silencing her protests. He looked the man straight in the eye, his expression calm and serious. "One song," he said. His voice was quiet but firm, a bargain being struck in the quiet, warm shop. "You have one song." The words "one song" hung in the air of the quiet shop, a fragile agreement between two different worlds. For a moment, no one moved. The young woman, Chloe, stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of disbelief and disapproval. The owner, Mr. Allister, remained calm, his eyes fixed on the man, giving him the space he had asked for. And the man, the rain-soaked stranger from the street, seemed to be frozen in time. His gaze locked on the beautiful instrument before him. He took a slow step forward, then another. His wet shoes left a trail of dark footprints on the pristine floor, a path from the harsh world outside to this sacred space. He walked not like a homeless man, but like a pilgrim approaching a shrine. There was a reverence in his movements, a deep and profound respect that silenced even Chloe's skeptical thoughts. He reached the bench and stopped, simply looking at the piano as if he was seeing an old friend he never thought he would meet again. He reached out a hand, but not towards the keys. His fingers, grimy and worn, gently touched the polished side of the piano. He ran his hand slowly along the smooth, curved wood, a gesture of such tenderness it was almost heartbreaking. It was as if he was reassuring the instrument, or perhaps himself, that this was real. Then he carefully lifted the heavy fallboard, revealing the perfect rows of ivory and ebony keys. They were bright and clean under the soft spotlights, a stark contrast to his own dirty fingers. He sat down on the leather bench. The first time he had been able to properly sit in years. A quiet sigh escaped his lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. His posture, which had been slumped and defeated on the street, changed. His back straightened. His shoulders, once hunched against the cold, relaxed and settled. He was no longer a shadow. He was becoming a person again. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. They looked clumsy and broken, yet they held a strange, poised energy, like a coiled spring. The silence in the room was so thick you could feel it. Chloe found herself holding her breath without even realizing it. Then, his fingers descended. The first notes that rang out were not a simple tune or a happy melody. They were deep, heavy, and full of a sorrow so profound it seemed to suck the air out of the room. It was the sound of loneliness, a single, mournful voice crying out in the vast, empty darkness. The notes were slow and deliberate, each one a drop of cold rain hitting a puddle. The melody was a story, and it was a story of loss. It spoke of walking on cold pavement when everyone else was warm inside. It spoke of hunger, not just for food, but for human connection. It spoke of the gnawing ache of being forgotten, of becoming invisible. The music was the sound of his life on the streets. A raw and painful confession poured out through 88 black and white keys. Chloe, who had been ready to call the police just minutes before, now stood frozen behind her counter. The duster she was holding slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud, but she didn't notice. Her professional mask was gone, replaced by an expression of pure shock and a dawning understanding. This wasn't a homeless man. This was a storyteller. His story was the saddest thing she had ever heard. Mr. Allister stood near his office door, his hand covering his mouth. He had heard thousands of pianists in his life, from students to world-famous concert artists, but none of them had ever played like this. They played with technique, with practice, with skill. This man played with his soul. He was playing every tear he had never cried, every cold night he had ever endured, every cruel word he had ever heard. The music was not perfect. There were missed notes and hesitations, but these imperfections only made it more real, more powerful. They were the cracks in his voice, the stumbles in his speech, just as the sadness became almost too much to bear. Something incredible began to happen. A new note appeared in the melody, a single, clear sound that was different from the others. It was small and fragile, like a tiny candle lit in a dark room. At first it was almost lost in the river of sorrow, but it persisted. It grew stronger, more confident. A new theme began to weave itself into the music. It was still tinged with sadness, but there was something else there now, something that felt like hope. The tempo began to change, the slow, mournful pace quickening just a little. The melody started to climb, rising up from the deep, low notes into the brighter, higher registers. It was like a flower pushing its way through a crack in the concrete. It was the feeling of the first warm day after a long winter. It was the memory of a kind word from a stranger, the taste of a hot meal on a freezing night. The music was no longer just a story of pain. It was becoming a story of survival. It was the sound of a spirit that had been beaten down, but had not been broken. A wealthy couple, who had been browsing a few minutes before, stood completely still. They had come in looking for a piano for their daughter, a status symbol for their large empty house. They had looked at the man with disgust when he first entered, whispering to each other about the state of the city. Now, they were silent. The man's expensive suit and the woman's glittering jewelry seemed out of place, almost shameful in the presence of such raw, honest emotion. They looked at each other, and their faces, which had been hard and judgmental, were now soft and humbled. They were not just listening to music. They were being forced to see the humanity they had spent their lives ignoring. The man at the piano had his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly to the side. He was no longer in the showroom. He was lost in a world of his own creation, a world of sound and feeling. His fingers, which had looked so clumsy and dirty, now danced across the keys with a grace and power that was breathtaking. They flew up and down the keyboard, coaxing out a torrent of notes that were complex and beautiful. The two themes, the sorrow and the hope, began to intertwine, weaving together into a tapestry of sound that was more real and more vivid than anything else in the room. It was the story of a life, a complete story with all its pain and all its beauty, told in just a few minutes. Then, as suddenly as it began, it started to end. The hopeful theme began to fade, and the sorrowful melody returned, but it was different now. It was quieter, gentler, as if the pain had been eased by the memory of hope. The notes became slower, more spaced out, until finally his fingers played one last soft chord. He held it for a long moment, letting the sound fill the room. And then he lifted his hands from the keys. The final note faded into silence, but the silence was not empty. It was full. It was vibrating with the echoes of the story that had just been told. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the quiet hum of the shop's lights and the distant sound of the rain, which now seemed gentle and sad instead of harsh and cold. The man opened his eyes. The fire in them, the passion, and the life that had been there while he was playing began to dim. The weight of his reality, the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, came crashing back down upon him. He seemed to shrink on the bench, his shoulders slumping once more. He stood up slowly, avoiding the gazes of the people in the room, and looked down at his hands as if he was surprised by what they had just done. He mumbled a gruff, quiet thank you, turned, and began to walk towards the door, as if ashamed of the raw, beautiful thing he had just let escape. The last note from the piano seemed to hang in the air, a delicate, shimmering thing that refused to disappear. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence filling every corner of the quiet shop. The silence that followed was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, full silence, packed with the story that had just been told. It was the kind of silence that you could feel in your chest, a deep, resonant hum that made you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. The only other sounds were the gentle hum of the spotlights on the pianos and the soft, rhythmic tapping of the rain against the large window, a sound that now seemed less like an assault and more like a sad. Steady applause for the performance that had just ended. The man at the bench sat perfectly still for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly on the keys as if they were still warm from the music. Then the life seemed to drain out of him. The fire that had been in his eyes, the passion that had lifted his shoulders and straightened his back, flickered and died. He slumped forward, the weight of his reality crashing back down upon him with the force of a physical blow. He was no longer a brilliant musician, a master of his craft. He was just a man in a wet, dirty coat, sitting in a place where he didn't belong. He pulled his hands back from the keys as if they had burned him and looked down at them with a sense of confusion, as if they belonged to someone else. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff and awkward. He kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the dark, wet footprints he had left on the pristine floor. They looked like a trail of shame leading back to the world he came from. He couldn't bear to look at the people in the room. He didn't want to see their pity or their curiosity or their judgment. He had just laid his soul bare for them, and now he felt exposed, raw, and deeply ashamed. He mumbled a gruff, almost inaudible thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the piano, to the room, to the moment. Then he turned and began to walk towards the door, his only thought to escape, to melt back into the shadows where he was invisible again, behind the counter. The young woman, Chloe, felt a lump form in her throat. The duster lay on the floor at her feet, completely forgotten. Just a few minutes ago, she had seen this man as a problem, a nuisance to be dealt with. She had been annoyed by his presence, scared by his appearance. But now she felt a wave of shame, so hot it made her cheeks burn. The music had stripped away all her prejudices and all her assumptions. It had forced her to see the person underneath the dirt and the rags. She saw not a homeless man, but a father, a son, a man who had loved and lost so deeply that it had broken him. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to do something, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The silence was too sacred to break. The wealthy couple, who had been looking for a piano to match their expensive furniture, stood as if they had been turned to stone. The man's hand, which had been resting proprietorially on the back of a polished upright, now hung loosely at his side. The woman clutched her designer purse to her chest, not as a status symbol, but as if she needed something to hold on to. They looked at each other, and in their eyes there was no trace of the superiority they had walked in with. They looked humbled, small. They had spent their lives collecting things. But they had just witnessed something that no amount of money could ever buy. Pure, unfiltered, devastating honesty. The man on the street had just shown them a depth of feeling they had never even known existed. Their own lives, with their busy schedules and their endless pursuits, suddenly seemed shallow and meaningless. As the man reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly, a quiet but firm voice cut through the silence. Wait, it was the owner. He had been standing by his office, watching everything with his kind, knowing eyes. He had seen the man's retreat, the shame in his posture, and he knew he couldn't let him leave like this. Not after what he had shared with them. The man froze, his hand just inches from the cool metal of the doorknob. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his back to them, a tense, rigid figure, waiting for the inevitable. He expected to hear a police car being called, to be told never to come back. He braced himself for the harsh words that would send him back out into the cold, wet night. The owner walked slowly towards him, his steps soft on the floor. He stopped a few feet away, giving the man his space. "Who taught you to play like that?" he asked. His voice wasn't demanding or suspicious. It was filled with a quiet, genuine wonder. The voice of a man who had just witnessed a miracle and wanted to understand it. The man's shoulders slumped even further. He shook his head slightly, a silent refusal to speak. The words were locked away inside him, buried under years of pain and silence. To talk about it would be to open the wound all over again. "Please," the owner said gently as if reading his mind. "We just heard your story in the music now. Let us hear it in words. We're not here to judge you. We're just listeners." The man slowly turned around. His face was a mask of conflict, a war being fought between his desperate need to remain hidden and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being truly seen. He looked at the owner's kind face, then at Chloe, who was watching him with tears in her eyes, and then at the wealthy couple who looked at him not with pity, but with a deep, profound respect. He realized for the first time in a very long time that he wasn't being judged. He was being heard. He took a shaky breath and began to speak, his voice rough and halting at first. There was a life before," he started, his eyes looking past them, at a memory only he could see. A small apartment. It always smelled of wood polish and coffee. There was a woman. She laughed like music. And a little girl. She had small, chubby hands that loved to bang on the keys while I tried to practice. A faint, sad smile touched his lips for a second, then vanished. I had a scholarship. They said I was going to be great. I played in small concert halls. People would clap. I had everything. He stopped, swallowing hard, the memories clearly painful. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Then, one day, it was just gone. He didn't need to say how. The grief in his voice was explanation enough. The apartment was silent. The piano just sat there. It wasn't my friend anymore. It was a reminder. Every note I tried to play was a ghost. It was the sound of her laughter, the sound of his footsteps running down the hall. The music, which was my whole life, became the source of all my pain. So I stopped. I walked away. From the music, from the apartment, from everything. He looked down at his hands again. I didn't want to be great anymore. I just wanted to be nothing. It was easier that way. If you're nothing, you can't lose anything, he finished his story. His voice barely a whisper, and stood there, stripped bare, the final, painful piece of his soul laid out on the showroom floor for everyone to see. The owner looked at him, his heart aching with a profound empathy. He looked at the broken man, the silent piano, and the small group of people whose lives had just been irrevocably changed, and he knew with absolute certainty what he had to do next. The silence that followed the man's story was deeper and more profound than the one after his music. The music had been a cry from the soul, but the words were the soul itself, laid bare and vulnerable. The air in the shop felt heavy, thick with the unspoken grief of a life shattered. The man stood there, his head bowed, bracing himself for the final blow. He had told his secret, and now he waited for the rejection, the awkward pity, the gentle but firm pushback out into the cold night. It was a pattern he knew all too well, but the owner didn't push him away. He took another slow step closer, closing the distance between them. He looked at the man not as a charity case, but as an equal, a fellow human being who had been carrying an impossible weight. The owner's kind eyes were filled with a deep, unwavering compassion that was more comforting than any words. He saw the man's exhaustion, not just in his body, but in his spirit. He saw a man who had run out of strength, a man who had let go of everything because holding on was too painful. The owner reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, brass key. It was a simple, unremarkable key, the kind that opens a back door or a storage closet. He held it out in the palm of his hand, offering it to the man. The man looked at the key, then at the owner's face, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. He didn't take it. He had learned long ago that nothing in life is free, especially not kindness. "Can't go back out there," the owner said, his voice soft but firm, leaving no room for argument. "Not tonight. Not after this." He gestured with the key towards a small, unassuming door at the back of the shop, next to his office. "There's a small room in there. It's not much, just a cot and a bathroom. But it's warm and it's dry. You can stay there." The man shook his head slowly, a reflexive gesture of denial. I can't," he stammered. "I don't have anything. I can't pay you." "I'm not asking for money," the owner replied, his gaze unwavering. "I'm asking for a trade." He looked from the man's tired face to the beautiful, silent grand piano that stood in the center of the room. "You can stay here. In exchange, you play. Not for customers. Not for an audience. Just for you. And maybe for me. Sometimes this shop has a lot of beautiful pianos, but it's been a long time since it's had this much life in it." The offer was so unexpected, so completely outside the man's experience, that he couldn't process it. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a handout. It was an exchange. It was a recognition of his worth, of the one thing he had left in the world, his music. For the first time in years, someone wasn't seeing him as a homeless man. They were seeing him as a musician. Just then, the wealthy man who had been standing silently with his wife stepped forward. He cleared his throat, his voice a little unsteady. "Sir," he said, addressing the man by the piano, "my wife and I, we were wrong about you, what you did tonight. It was the most honest thing I've ever witnessed." He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a expensive-looking leather wallet. He took out not a few crumpled bills, but a thick stack of them. He held it out, but the man flinched away, shaking his head again. "No, please," the wealthy man insisted, his voice gentle. "This isn't charity. Think of it as an investment in a new suit, a hot meal, a good night's sleep. A man with your talent deserves to feel like a man again." His wife nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. She stepped forward and placed a hand gently on the man's arm. A small, warm gesture of connection that made him flinch, but not pull away from behind the counter. The young woman, Chloe, finally found her feet. She hurried into the small back room where there was a tiny kitchenette and came back with a steaming mug of something. "It's just tea," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But it's hot." She held it out to him, her eyes full of a remorseful kindness. The man was surrounded. He was trapped in a circle of compassion, a feeling so foreign and overwhelming it was almost terrifying. He looked at the key in the owner's hand, at the money in the wealthy man's hand, at the warm tea in the young woman's hand. These were not the things of his world. His world was cold pavement and empty stomachs and harsh words. This was something else entirely. This was grace. He looked at the owner, his eyes searching for the catch, for the hidden motive, but he found none. He only saw sincerity. He thought about the cold, rainy night waiting for him outside. He thought about the long, lonely hours until dawn. And then he looked at the piano. He thought about the feeling of the keys under his fingers, the way the music had flowed out of him. A river of pain and beauty that had, for a few minutes, made him feel whole again. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out. But he didn't take the money or the tea. His hand went straight for the key. His dirty, trembling fingers closed around the small, warm piece of brass. It felt solid and real in his palm, a tangible promise of a different kind of life. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. The words were stuck in his throat, choked by a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. But he didn't need to speak. The look in his eyes said everything. It was a look of profound, bone-deep gratitude. A fragile, uncertain smile touched his lips. It was a small, rusty thing, a smile that hadn't been used in years, but it was there. It transformed his face, wiping away the years of hardship and revealing the person he had been, the person he still was underneath it all. The owner smiled back, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He nodded towards the back room. "Go on, get some rest." The man nodded, clutching the key in his hand as if it was the most precious treasure in the world. He gave the piano one last, long look, a look full of promise and reunion. Then he turned and walked towards the small door, his steps no longer those of a defeated man, but of someone taking the first step on a long journey home. Later that night, long after the shop had closed and the city outside had grown quiet, the owner was getting ready to leave. As he walked past the main showroom, he heard a faint sound. He stopped and peered through the darkness. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, he could see a figure at the grand piano. The man was sitting there, his back straight, his hands resting on the keys. He wasn't playing the storm of emotions from before. He was playing something else, something simple and quiet, a gentle, hopeful melody that filled the silent shop like a soft, warm light. It was the sound of a man finding his way back, one note at a time. The owner smiled to himself, locked the front door, and left him to his music, leaving a light on in the window for the new dawn.